Welcome everyone to Microsoft 365 Virtual Marathon. Thanks for attending and we hope you're having a great conference so far. I'd like to introduce Sean. He will be presenting the session on troubleshooting performance issues in SharePoint Online sites. And I'll hand over to him now. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you very much, Lucy. So my name is Sean McDonough. I'm a consultant. I'm also an MVP, and this is troubleshooting performance issues in SharePoint Online sites. Let's see here. And as you know, we are doing this because we can't physically be together in Vegas, so this is the next best thing. Thank you to our sponsors. These are the folks that make this happen and can make it available to all of us for free. So thank you. And are you ready for a raffle? Apparently we're giving away 3 Oculus Quests. I have one of these personally, and I can tell you they are wonderful units. They are fun to play with. There are lots of great games and adventures on them, so have fun with them. And consider donating to one of the charity relief funds for the COVID issues we're dealing with in the pandemic right now. So let me introduce myself a little bit. I'm Microsoft Office Apps and Services MVP. I've been working with SharePoint since 2004, both as a developer and as an IT pro. I've been in a number of roles. I've been an evangelist. I've been a product manager. So I've seen SharePoint from many different angles, but these days I focus primarily on development work. I do build intranets with Akumina. I do a lot of PowerShell scripting. I jokingly call PowerShell methadone for developers. It doesn't quite scratch the itch, but it gets us close enough. I have 2 kids, Brendan and Sabrina, 13 years old. They just graduated 7th grade. And my wife, Tracy, is a clinical psychologist and professor at a local college. And I am a lover of all things donut. And many of you who have seen me in the community have known me to have a donut in my hand a time or two. So here's what we're going to talk about for the next hour. I want to look at some SharePoint Online analysis tools. I want to diagnostically look at a SharePoint site and use some of our tools to kind of pick it apart. I want to talk about why things are the way they are with SharePoint Online. And I also want to provide some guidance for making your SharePoint Online sites quick, because guidance is changing all the time. I do have references and links, not necessarily in this particular deck, but if you go to my site, which will be at the end, I can provide all sorts of references. So we have to start with an important acknowledgement. You know, Microsoft Office 365 or Microsoft 365 is an evergreen service. And that's Microsoft's way of telling us that this can change at any time. And it carries many implications. The information I'm going to share with you certainly has a shelf life. So I hope and I request that you don't find me in 5 years and send me hate mail because of something I presented here turns out not to be true because of a SharePoint Online service change. You may laugh at that, but somebody will do it, I'm sure. They'll find something I said and say, that doesn't work that way. Well, it doesn't work that way anymore, of course. So if we can agree to that, I will go forward. So let's talk about tools a little bit. And the one tool in particular for diagnosing performance problems that is of interest to us is the Page Diagnostics tool for SharePoint. This is a Chrome browser extension. It is very easy to get. We'll probably do a demo here in a bit where we go and do that. But what is the Page Diagnostics tool for SharePoint? Well, let's talk about it a little bit first. This tool, this extension for Chrome, what it does is it analyzes the HTTP exchange between your client browser and the SharePoint Online web front end. And the exchange of messages between the server and the client gets logged and analyzed by the tool. And basically that whole conversation gets pulled apart and analyzed. And what we get out of that is a lot of good data on how long it takes to do things like load pages, all sorts of things. The page diagnostics tool works with modern and classic sites. When it was initially released a few years back, it was only functional with classic sites, but modern sites have been rolled into it. And it calls out problems it sees and links to resolution guidance. So, you know, as is illustrated here on the screen, my particular site, this run with the page diagnostics tool indicates that large images were detected. And if I were to expand that, it would show me what image is causing the problem, as well as give me links to Microsoft, excuse me, it will give me links to Microsoft Docs to read up on how I might address that issue of the image being too large and what I could do about it. So it uses color coding, the stoplight kind of color codes, red, green, yellow. Red, of course, is bad, green is good. It returns HTTP response headers of interest, particularly a handful that are really interesting to us in performance troubleshooting land, which I'll go into in a bit. The data that's collected by the tool can actually be dumped out as an HTTP archive or an HAR file. HAR is a format, it's a JSON JavaScript object notation file format that is easily ingested by other tools like Fiddler and Edge browser or IE as a browser, the dev tools. So if you have another tool that you prefer to use when looking at these sites and trying to diagnose them, you can take the data from the diagnostics tool and port it over to that tool and pull it up there if you prefer to do that. And the best part of all of this is completely and totally free. Microsoft wants us to make our sites more performant, better, faster. Everybody wins with this. So the exchange of data that takes place between SharePoint Online and our client system, as we send out HTTP requests, we naturally get HTTP responses, and those are accompanied by payload. And the payload in this case might be a file, it might be an image, a JavaScript, whatever. And so these things are being looked at kind of at a macro level by the tool. It's not diving down into the files themselves, but rather analyzing them at the surface level, seeing how long it takes to load them, things like how long or how large they are, etc. And if we look at the exchange data, what we'll find, we'll get several pieces of really important information. First of all, we get a total time to load on each file that's requested, along with a color indicator, whether or not it's taking too long. I think the breakpoint is half a second, 500 milliseconds. That's when we go yellow. So we get overall page load time. We get an SP request GUID, which is surfaced as a correlation ID, and that shows up directly within the tool. We get an SP request duration, and the SP request duration is the amount of time that is spent on the server processing a page in order for the server to render it and send it back down to the browser. So it's the processing time that's spent on the server. So SP request duration is of particular interest to us when we're trying to diagnose problems. SPIIS latency is another header that we care about. SPIIS latency is the amount of time that a request spends waiting in the IIS queue before it gets processed by the web front end. So you've basically arrived at the server and you're waiting to be processed. That is the IIS latency, the amount of time that you spend in line basically waiting. And if we take several of these numbers, and in the example I've got here, I've got highlighted several rows of information. This equation actually gives us an indication of where we might be seeing problems in the system if the system is slow. So consider, for example, you're going out to SharePoint Online and you're trying to hit your site, and it's taking, let's say 12 seconds for the page to load. Your page load time is 12 seconds. Well, if it's 12 seconds, you plop that in, the tool that reports 12 seconds, that's the page load time. You subtract the SP request duration plus the SPIIS latency, which, if you think about it, these represent the amount of time that the request spends on the server, roughly speaking, and you then subtract that from the total round trip time, and what you're left with is time lost elsewhere, TLE, I like to call it. And this can be time that's spent in routing, going through proxies, doing DNS lookups, egressing out to the internet, and then having to trip back around if you're in an environment where you're not immediately able to get to the Microsoft network. There are a whole host of things that can cause delays that would qualify as this TLE type time. So that's an important equation to keep in mind. And I've got a post about this on my blog, the SharePointInterface.com. You can go out there and find it. It's the 5-minute page performance troubleshooting guide, or something to that effect. So let's see. The basics: rule-based analysis of the exchange. The tool not only reports data back in the form of timing and other measurements, but it will do certain checks and run certain rules against the request. So, for instance, if I have structural navigation implemented on my site in SharePoint Online, structural navigation is notoriously slow. It's horrible. It's the worst thing in the world. And we don't want to use structural navigation. Now, structural navigation with caching is a different story. That's up and coming, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But, managed navigation was the way we were instructed to go for the longest time. If we had a slow site and it was due to structural navigation, we would switch over to managed navigation and use that instead. So navigation checks are something that the tool will do. It will perform tests to make sure that you are actually in a user context rather than an admin context, since admins get certain passes and can access certain files more readily and easily. It's not fair from a performance standpoint to evaluate performance as an admin. You should be running as a standard user. And it'll do things like image sizes. It'll check those. It'll check the iframes and the number of iframes you're trying to place in a page, web parts, how heavy they are, what their speed is. And this one at the bottom, the use of content delivery networks, is a big one. This, I will come back to this again, but content delivery networks factor enormously into SharePoint Online performance. So whenever you think SharePoint Online and you want to get better performance, you should be thinking about content delivery networks. And I'll expand on that in a bit. So if we take the tool and we export this data to an HTTP archive file, you know, it's just text data, it's JSON data. And that can be pulled up in a text editor, and an example is shown here on the screen. There's no problem reading it if you choose to do so. It holds the complete set of exchanges with a web front end, and it can, you know, it might be informative to you to read it this way. I don't get a lot out of it, but I rather look at it in something like Fiddler or Internet Explorer. And a common question that comes up is, where's the HAR file saved by default? It ends up in your machine's downloads folder. So let's actually do a little bit of a demo here. And I will pull up a browser. And whoops. Boy, I just pulled something back. Oh, there we go. All right. Let's see. Can you see that, Lucy? Can you see Google Chrome? Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm in my browser and I want to use the tool itself. If I go up here, you'll notice this icon. That is the icon for the page diagnostics tool. So if I click on it, this pops open. You know, it tells me what it does, but it can't run against just any old page. It needs to be running against a SharePoint environment. So let's go to a SharePoint environment. And this is the landing page for my company's tenant. It's rather boring, but it will serve as a decent target for the tool. So if I want to use this tool, and actually let me rewind a little bit. How do I get the tool? Well, for those of you who are Chrome users, and the tool is only available on Chrome, unfortunately. There was a desire to bring the tool out on Edge and Internet Explorer, but that just didn't come to fruition. So let's go to more tools, extensions. And if I were to type page diagnostics tool, it would be the one that comes up, of course, and you'll see it. I've got it installed already, naturally, but if you install it, you'll have to accept a set of permissions that will be used by the tool. The tool does a number of things kind of in an elevated context, so you have to accept the permissions requests that it makes. So let's go back here. And if I'm going to diagnose this page, I'm going to click start. Now, before I click start, if I'm going to want to capture the data for external viewing or use, I'd want to check this enable exporting of HTTP archive checkbox, because that is what will generate my HAR file. And then I click start, and you'll notice the tool sits, collects data as my page loads. And I have to stop the tool because most pages in SharePoint Online, they have JavaScript that produces recurring callbacks. And so it's almost like a never loading, ever loading page, if you will. So let's look at what we got here. Content delivery network check, I failed. There are 3 items that could be put in a content delivery network. So, and it spells out explicitly what those items are, which is good to know. The request to SharePoint. So apparently I'm making too many requests to SharePoint on my home page. And it calls all those out. Of course, I'm using structural navigation, which is a big no-no in SharePoint Online. And I am who I am. I'm an elevated user. So I'm not running as a standard user. These are all the things I'm doing wrong, and I should fix to get my site more performant. Things that I'm doing right, I don't have any large images. I don't have any content by query web parts. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit, because content query web parts are one of those things that causes tremendous tanking when it comes to performance. So the page diagnostics tool gave me a bunch of information on this page load. So I'm going to go over to the network trace tab, and this is where I see my export to HAR box, or rather button. I click that, and the dialog that pops up prompts me to save that file somewhere. So I'm just going to stick it in, let me just throw it on the desktop right now. And I'll save that. And so that file is now on my desktop. So if I were to pull up Fiddler, I will bring this over to this window. We've got Fiddler here. I'll stop capturing traffic. And oh, brother, lots of different things are happening here. Fiddler's getting busy. Okay, stop the capture. And let's say I want to pull up that file. So I'm going to load an archive. Let's go to my desktop. I want an HAR archive, so let's look at all files. Yeah, I think I need to import it. Yeah, that's what I need to do, import. Sorry about that, folks. I can import it, and here's my exchange with Office 365 in Fiddler. So I'm looking at the series of calls that were made to my site, and I can see Bitstream Foundry, my theme there, request for a JavaScript file, process query endpoint. So that dialog has been captured within that archive and is now available for me to analyze here. And if I want to do that, I can, and I want to analyze it further, I can do that. You know, I can, if I really care about the page that was loaded, I could go ahead and find my home page, come over to my inspectors tab here, and I can look at the headers that I get back. And we can see that the various headers are in place. I don't know that we've got let's see, we've got the request GUID. So this is how we used to have to do kind of this performance troubleshooting. We would go in and look at the headers with tools like Fiddler and the browser tools. SharePoint health score 0, which is good. That means that ranges from 0 to 10. 0 means the server is basically not doing much at all, so it's not loaded. And if we get to 10, then the server starts selectively shutting processes down. But these headers, we would have to come in with a tool like Fiddler to get these out. And the page diagnostics tool does a very nice job for us and makes it easy to read that information without having to dive into a whole host of other tools. But those tools are available to us if we want to use them and do further analysis. So that's the page diagnostics tool. And like I said, version 2.11 is the current version. And Microsoft is actively working on that tool and evolving it. So I would get a copy of it and run it in your environment today, run it against your tenant. In fact, that tool becomes a requirement, particularly if you're going to be doing something like a site swap, where you might want to swap a modern site into your root namespace within your tenant. You would need to then run the tool against it, and the tool's going to have to give you a passing grade. So the diagnostics tool is doing more than just diagnostics these days. It's evaluating fitness of sites as well. So let's get back to the slideware here. Okay. So let's say you've concluded that your site is slow. It's okay. You're not alone. Really, you're not. A lot of people have slow sites. I've seen some very, very slow sites. There are always interesting stories behind those. Fixing most of the performance issues is an iterative process. You go through it again and again. There's not like one single switch you can flip. We start with the big hitters, I call them, easy to address items. We deal with those and we work our way down to more esoteric or technical level fixes. So besides the page diagnostics tool, Microsoft has compiled a lot of guidance for you. If you go out to ak.ms/portal health, that page is an awesome resource for anyone trying to build a portal site with SharePoint Online and get started with performance and build things correctly in a way that will scale and grow as SharePoint Online, their SharePoint Online adoption increases. So acknowledging where we are, a lot of folks run into performance problems because they treat SharePoint Online as if they were running SharePoint on their own network. And that's not a good way to do things. The cloud is different from on-prem. You have less bandwidth and a whole lot more latency. And what this does is it amplifies the impact of bad decision making. So if you've got a process that you execute as part of your page load, and you're doing some things that maybe you shouldn't be doing because they're sloppy or take a little bit too much time, those are going to be amplified, and you're going to know about it pretty readily. So the nice thing is SharePoint does have some tools that can help us with this. For instance, the image rendition service in SharePoint is an excellent addition. It's an image processing engine that's been built into SharePoint, and what it can do is resize images for us. And if you've ever used it, you can create, like postage stamp type image cutouts or different views, resize images, and it does a wonderful job of that. And in fact, to use that requires the blob cache, because that's where the image rendition service stores the images that it produces as a result of its operations. So those go into the blob cache. Oftentimes when we have problems out in the cloud with performance and we're dealing with performance issues, we come into a situation, oftentimes I'll classify it as, too many or too big. That is, too many processes are running, too many requests are being made, the files are too large. There are different ways to address this. When you're building a SharePoint Online site, you're really kind of building a site to be lean, and that's your goal. You should put your site on a diet. So some alternatives to too big or too many: minify your files, particularly JavaScript files. Lots of JavaScript. We've shifted the load off of the server onto the client, and that's pretty good. We can utilize the processing power of our desktops, but we need to recognize that pulling those JavaScripts down to process does take time and resources. So if you minify those files, it will strip out spaces and provide you with a much leaner file. You can resize images to their actual usage sizes. This is the problem where your grandma sends you an email that includes a photo that's like 5 megabytes large, and it's totally too big for email, but she just wants to show you the picture. In SharePoint, the best thing to do is get that image to a size that you're going to use it at. So size it accordingly. Tools like Photoshop, plenty of free tools are available to manipulate images, and that rolls into the next piece of advice, which is compress images more aggressively to get size down. Not all image file formats are equivalent. So if we take a look at image file formats, we've got JPEG, we've got GIF or GIF, both pronunciations, of course, being valid. PNGs, JPEGs are a good format for pictures and other data that we can compress down. We can set the compression ratios on JPEG files to the level we want, so we can really mash the images down in size. That's often balanced against if you compress too aggressively, you will see artifacts appear in your images. So you have to find the sweet spot between too aggressively compressing your images and not compressing them enough. PNG, I like to use PNG files because it's a lossless format. There's no loss. JPEG is a lossy compression mechanism. PNG, there's no loss of fidelity. It supports an alpha channel, so transparency is allowed. So knowing what file types support what properties and capabilities is a good thing too. Additionally, building sprite sheets to reduce the number of HTTP requests needed to retrieve all images. So on the screen, I've got right here, I'm moving my mouse around it. Yeah, of course, I immediately took myself off of the slide I wanted to be on, but that is a sprite sheet, and you guys have probably seen that where SharePoint doesn't quite load a page correctly. A sprite sheet can be thought of as like a sheet of stamps. If I want to get a lot of images down to a client, a sprite sheet might be a good opportunity to do that, and might be a good mechanism for it, because a sprite sheet, the nice thing about a sprite sheet is you pack all of those images into a single file and you download that file once, so you only pay latency costs on the wire once rather than for each individual image. So you save quite a bit of time and requests and latency, and you use CSS techniques to create basically stamps or little windows into that sprite sheet, and that's how those images get used. So that's how sprite sheets work, and there are tools online you can use to build sprite sheets. If you have source images, there are sprite sheets that you can use yourself and CSS that goes with them, and that rolls into Font Awesome, which I'm talking about next. That's another great way to speed up your site. Is for those of you who aren't familiar with Font Awesome, it is an incredible tool. Basically, what you're doing with Font Awesome is you've got a web font that gets sent down to the browser, but instead of letters, there are all sorts of images and social icons and arrows, stop signs, things like that. Those, because a font file technically is just a vector format file that can scale as needed, and they are processed, those font files are processed in that fashion. We don't think about loading fonts often when we're building our pages, and so, you know, a font, you download that, and if it has images in it, you can use Font Awesome, which is, you know, this font which is nothing but images, in place of things like individual social icons and others that you might download. And that's a great way to accelerate and improve performance on your sites. So check out Font Awesome. It's freely available. I know I kickstarted the most recent release of it. So there are a bunch of backers out there. It's a great project. I applaud the folks who put that together. All right, so going forward. So traditionally, SharePoint has leveraged caching mechanisms to make sites more performant. And one very important cache that SharePoint uses at a low basic level is the object cache. And on-premises environments use the object cache quite a bit. But for all intents and purposes, SharePoint Online has no object cache. Now, I'm not going to get into technicalities, but you can effectively think of SharePoint Online as having no object cache, because when you're in an online environment, there are simply too many people in the environment and too much data to cache all of it in an object cache. And so that system doesn't work. And so there are systems in SharePoint that rely on the object cache for decent performance, things like traditional structural navigation. Traditional structural nav without object cache support is the #1 performance killer of SharePoint Online sites. Now, Microsoft has figured out a way around this. They're coming up with something it's rolling called cached structural nav. It beats out managed navigation. That's rolling out right now. I had a conversation with Scott Stewart at Microsoft a little bit earlier this week, and we were talking about it, and he told me it's rolling out, and it can take a situation where you've got thousands of SQL requests that are needed to generate structural navigation data and render structural nav elements. It takes those thousands of requests and you basically drop down to like a couple of SQL requests because everything is cached, and it just is an awesome performance enhancement. Let's see, if you're using classic sites, try moving to modern. The modern experience has been designed to operate better in the online environment, in the cloud environment. We want to be using modern websites. Also, if you or your users are big fans and holdouts on the content query web parts or content by query web parts, you got to stop it. Get them off of those and get them to content search web parts if you can. I know that not every situation can be addressed by a content search web part or a search solution, but if you can use a search solution, it's going to definitely improve your performance, hands down, because content by query web parts, those cross-site queries are very expensive and they take time, and that CPU hit will slow your site down. It directly affects your site. So be aware of that. Now, content by query web parts, one thing they can do that the content search web parts cannot is use audiences. If you are using SharePoint audiences in your content query web parts, I'm unaware of a content search web part solution or workaround for that, including in the modern environment. But I only spend a minimal amount of time actually working on search during a normal day. There are far better people to talk about search, and I'm sure some of them are giving presentations during this marathon as well. So there's a face I want to get out to everybody. That guy is on your side. That is Scott Stewart. He is the program manager at Microsoft, and he is responsible for portals and how they perform. He is the #1 guy on your side, and he has a bunch of guidance on building sites that are more performant. He suggests that you keep your pages light with fewer than 25 references. That's not always possible, of course, but keep the number of references down in your pages. Employ lazy loading. That is, load above the fold. Don't load content that users haven't seen yet. So wait till a user scrolls down to actually load. Respond to those events and load as a result of the event rather than preemptively loading. If you're building custom web parts, keep them simple. Don't try to do too much. Scott said he's seeing a lot of JavaScript out there that's starting to bog down, particularly in the SharePoint extensions realm. So you folks who are building SharePoint extensions, pay attention to your performance metrics and run the diagnostics tool against your tenant. Make sure you're not killing your site. Employ caching wherever you can. And the #1 recommendation today is to use a CDN, a content delivery network. SharePoint Online has one built in. I've got the PowerShell for you right there. Set SPO tenant CDN enabled. That commandlet will enable both public and private CDN caching for assets in your SharePoint environment. Go do that now. That is the #1 thing that you should do to improve performance on your site. And don't forget AK.ms Portal Health for prescriptive guidance on building your sites out. Old guidance still applies. Use the modern experience, not classic. Don't turn on publishing. Preferentially use cached structural navigation over managed navigation and leverage search to your advantage. Understand what your JavaScripts are doing. If you are the type of person who employs JavaScript in your site without an understanding of what that script does or how it operates, you could be introducing significant performance problems into your environment unknowingly. So you should at least profile a script and understand how it operates, how it loads, and what it does before you go employing it within your environment. And of course, follow the recommendations of the page diagnostics tool because it will not steer you wrong and it will give you a much better experience if you follow its guidance. Your SharePoint Online site will be much more performant as a result. So what if your site, let's say you do all of this stuff and you go out and you've implemented everything I've talked about, you've put in sprite sheets and you're doing everything perfectly. What if your site is still slow? Well, that situation does occur on occasion. First of all, validate that you've done what you can through the page diagnostics tool itself. And if your time lost elsewhere, your TLE is high in that equation I showed earlier in the session, start looking at other things in your environment. If you have a high TLE, you might consider whitelisting Microsoft Office 365 destinations. You might have web proxies, particularly authenticating web proxies, involved in the mix in your environment. Look at your DNS lookups. How long do those take? Are there is asymmetric routing or unnecessary routing being implemented in your environment? How do you egress to the internet? And at what point do you egress? Do you get sent out of region before you egress to the internet? The age of networking equipment factors into this as well. So if you've got old networking equipment, it may not support certain protocols as well as certain compression mechanisms. So age is a factor. But if all else fails, of course, contact Microsoft Support Services, and they will be happy when you share what you've tried, hopefully from this session, in the process of trying to diagnose and solve your performance problems. But if you could do just one thing to improve performance, enable CDN use in your tenant. That's Scott's message to the world right now. And so I'm sending that out myself. Turn on CDNs. Now make sure you, of course, are within usage guidelines. There are public-private CDNs, and Microsoft has first-party CDNs. They use third-party Akamai. Make sure you understand the mix in there. But if that's not an issue, turn on the CDNs, because if you've got CDNs in play, that'll boost your performance, because not only does it give you a source of data that's closer to you, because CDNs typically are in region, so you pay less latency and bandwidth hops. You have that factored out of the equation, but you're going to a different namespace oftentimes, and the way browsers load resources, they can typically only load half a dozen resources at a time and have half a dozen concurrent streams going against a particular host name. And if you've got a CDN in place, that opens up another half dozen resources that can be loaded, because you're loading those from typically another domain. And so CDNs increase the level of degree of parallelism. DOP. Just go with DOP. I think it's easier. So that is pretty much it in a nutshell. I want to thank you folks for joining us. And we've got about, I want to say, 10 minutes or so left. I'm going to open it up to questions. Are there any questions coming in?
Yes, we have 3 questions popping up there.
All right, let me.
Can you see those ones?
Let's see here. I'll stop sharing my screen now. I think that'll, yeah, there we go. Okay. Okay. So, hey, Renee. Let's see.
Those questions there. I'll publish them for you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not seeing the question.
So the first question is HTTP the same with HTML? I think that was at the start of your session.
HTTP the same as HTML? HTTP is not the same as HTML, but I'm hopeful that that sorted itself out if it came up at the beginning of the session.
Second question here, I've noticed a very large, at least bigger than 1 terabyte document library has very slow performance. Would splitting the library into smaller libraries in the same site improve performance, or is it better to split across multiple sites?
Wow, that's a good question. Multiple terabytes. That's a scale I don't particularly have good advice for. If you're working at that scale, naturally breaking things up is going to probably make retrieving resources faster and easier. But you're operating on a scale that's several orders of magnitude off the scale that I'm operating on. So I don't have a very good answer for you on that. My apologies.
One last question. Is it available Edge Chrome? So I think that was the tool you're using.
The tool, the Page Diagnostics tool. It comes from the Chrome store. So I don't know if it's available for Edge Chrome or not. I neglected to ask Scott that. I was having a conversation with him the other day. So I'm not quite sure. But if you do a search, you'll at least have, you'll find the tool, or you won't, I guess.
And one last question. Does content size say large libraries, either thousands of files or files of large size, cause general site performance issues?
Large libraries and performance issues? No, generally not. I mean, the SharePoint is built to handle that. Generally speaking, the problem comes in when people try to access libraries, large lists and libraries, and they don't have an effective way to winnow down their view to fewer than a couple thousand or 5,000 items. That's where the problem typically comes in. But manipulating large lists and libraries, no, that's not generally a performance problem that I'm aware of.
And someone just said, looks like the page diagnostic tool is available in Edge Premium.
Oh, that's great. Fantastic.
Okay, so that's bringing us to the end of our session. So thank you very much, Sean. We are going to spend the next 2 minutes just setting up for the next session. So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much.